Tantor Audio, a division of Recorded Books, presents The Altruistic Urge, Why We're Driven to Help Others, by Stephanie D. Preston, narrated by Donna Postel. Preface. People say that the wackiest news comes from Florida. In just a quick sampling of online collections of these bizarre stories, you might encounter headlines like these. Florida man steals a car, realizes a baby is in it, drops baby off safely, and makes his getaway. Florida man arrested for driving stolen vehicle while monkey clings to chest. Florida man breaks into jail to hang with friends. Florida man steals bees because he thought they were abandoned. Pregnant woman rescues husband from shark attack in Florida. Florida man rescues puppy from jaws of alligator without dropping cigar. Besides showcasing the amusing, concerning, and even inspiring antics of Floridians, these actual stories share something else in common. They exhibit features of an evolved and natural urge to approach and care for those we are bonded to, care about, or perceive to be similar to a helpless infant, an urge that we sometimes even extend to adult strangers, pets, and wild animals. This rescue instinct is often displayed in our retellings of human heroism, like the pregnant woman from Florida who saw a dorsal fin and her husband's blood in the water and dove in, without hesitation, to pull him to safety. Or Wesley Autry, who dived onto subway tracks in New York City to save a young man from an oncoming train after the man fell into the tracks after a seizure. Such heroic rescues are even observed in other species, like the dog in Trinidad that saved his human companion from a house fire by barking and tugging at the man's pant leg until the man awoke. The same dog then died after running back into the burning home, perhaps to retrieve the pet parrot. These individuals seem heroic, if not a little crazy, or even stupid. How could a species evolve a predisposition to help others in a way that could endanger their very life? Why does this tendency exist across species? What does this urge have to do with the empathy, helpful personalities, or deep thoughts that we usually associate with our unique human capacity to give? Conversely, if we are so recklessly driven to save others, how can we also turn such a blind eye toward others suffering all over the world? I wrote this book to describe the nature of a specific form of altruism, which I call the altruistic urge, through an integrated theory of its evolution, psychology, and neural bases captured by the altruistic response model. Much ink has been spilled describing our general capacity for empathy, altruism, or even human morality writ large. This book is different because I decidedly do not try to explain our broad swath of human goodness. I simply make the argument that there exists a specific type of altruism that has persisted in our genome for quite a long time and exists across species, one that powerfully influences our motivation to help, even heroically. This particular form of altruism, the altruistic urge, has yet to be explored, and as such, deserves our dedicated time and attention to determine what it is, when it happens, and as important, when it does not. This book thus explains the altruistic response model, while combating common concerns with such a proposal, such as, I am not like a rat. I am not a caring person or mother. I do not feel urges to help. People are terrible, so your theory must be wrong. Do you think this explains all of altruism? Because it doesn't. We help others because it was necessary to win wars. And so on. Categorizing altruism. There are many kinds of altruism, but the fact that we don't have names for all of them causes confusion. I want to resolve this at the outset so that listeners know what this book is, and is not, about, The problem is not so much with the science, but with our impoverished semantics, which I wish were more precise, in the way that ornithologists create taxonomies of bird species with well-defined groups and names. My graduate school professor, Eleanor Roche, explained that people naturally categorize things, like birds, into different levels of abstraction. Most of us share the general concept of a bird as a small winged animal, which we represent in our minds as the average of all birds we have encountered. For example, North Americans might think of a typical bird as a passerine or songbird, like a sparrow or cardinal. Birds from other orders within the avian class share a common ancestor with songbirds, which causes them all to be grouped into the same vertebrate class. However, some birds look more different from the typical bird than others, like flightless penguins and ostriches. Because of this, if you saw an ostrich walking down the street, you might exclaim, "Look, an ostrich," rather than, "Look, a bird," because even if ostriches are technically birds, you would recognize that the general term would confuse your friend, who might look up into the trees rather than at the street. People with bird expertise also use bird names that are more specific than those used by non-experts, such that a regular person, who is not particularly interested in bird speciation, might point out the pretty bird to a friend on a walk, whereas married people who watch birds from the kitchen table every morning might refer to the red songbird, or Charlie, while birders would whisper excitedly to each other about the wood warbler or indigo bunting. There are different levels at which you can specify what you mean when you refer to birds, and people intuitively understand this and shift how they refer to them depending on their knowledge, audience, and situation. The concept of altruism is in many ways like the situation with birds. There are lots of different kinds. Some forms of altruism are more like what you would consider the typical type, whereas others may be observed only in specific environments. When most people hear the word altruism, they might imagine a saint who relinquishes worldly possessions to feed the poor, or a hero who rescues a stranger from a burning building. A biologist may think about the alarm calls of ground squirrels, or the aid that worker bees give to their queen. An economist may think about how many dollars a student donates to a stranger in a laboratory experiment. I might even consider the warm hug offered to a distressed friend. Even if you recognize each of these behaviors, you personally might not apply the label altruism to all of them. But unlike with the birds, even experts of altruism do not really follow an agreed-upon taxonomy of types of altruism that you could find in a textbook or memorize for a class. When scientists do try to make subdivisions of types of altruism, they usually draw the lines between species, or behaviors that look dissimilar. Originally, species were also divided up this way, putting birds together that looked similar to one another. But at this point, biologists also decide what counts as a bird from the evidence derived from fossils and wing morphology, even if penguins never come to mind when people think about birds. Something like this needs to happen for altruism. We need to define our taxonomies based on evidence from things that include the way the behavior looks or its function, while also considering when they evolved and how they are mediated in the brain and body. For example, even if an ant can free another trapped ant, in much the same way that a person can free the evil man's victim who has been roped to the train tracks, are the two the same? Do they rely upon the same neurophysiological mechanisms? Did they evolve from a common gene or a set of genes for a similar purpose? Moreover, things that look dissimilar but are present in the same species or period of development perhaps should not be grouped together if they did not emerge at the same time with the same mechanism. Thus, people assume that anything a human or great ape can do that a monkey or dog cannot do, must represent a single emergent process that requires a large brain. But many of these lauded behaviors are also present in birds or rats, who possess very small brains indeed. Thus, just as you do not want to assume that pterodactyls, ravens, bats, and butterflies belong together and share a common ancestor because they all have wings and fly, we do not want to assume that forms of altruism go together unless we examine the evidence from across biology, psychology, and neuroscience. This book is focused on one specific type of altruism, which my research reveals to be a natural kind in the taxonomy of acts of aid. The altruistic urge, as I call it, refers to events where any animal or person feels compelled to approach a vulnerable victim in immediate need of aid. This urge to respond appears to be evolutionarily ancient, like the wing of the bird that traces back to the theropod dinosaurs. The altruistic urge is different from the forms of altruism that are often described in the social sciences, which focus on a unique human capacity to consciously contemplate a decision to give. The altruistic urge does not make us special. It makes us more like other species, in fact. Sorry about that. However, if we understand this specific and powerful motivation, we can also explain seemingly nonsensical acts, such as heroism, and the opening examples from Florida. If we understand this motivation, we can use the knowledge to assist the suffering people who desperately need our aid but do not naturally inspire our urge to act, perhaps even Earth itself. Even though I argue that we must broadly apply the science of behavior to understand altruism, I also consider information about how the act looks and feels to be relevant. The father of ethology, Nico Tinbergen, opined that, in a desperate attempt to seem scientific, physiologists had lost the forest for the trees. Studies proliferated about this cell or that nervous system tract, but they lacked information about the animal or the behavior in which the element was embedded. Tinbergen was hopeful that this problem would be resolved through an emerging field that would merge ethology and physiology, supporting rich behavioral descriptions with the underlying neurophysiology, but I am not sure his dream was realized. Researchers who are studying altruism still try to seem more scientific, another term with a connotation that does not properly capture everything under it, by adding extensive control conditions to practicable laboratory experiments that produce statistically significant results. They focus on human acts that seem hard to explain, but that are simultaneously easy to control, measure, and compare, not acts that are similar to how we give to one another in the real world or our ancient past. Most current research on human altruism involves upper-middle-class, educated white students who give some money from the experimenter to another university student for no reason whatsoever. The focus on money has become so eclipsing that editors sometimes refuse to publish an experiment that does not involve money, because economists disbelieve that an act is truly costly or measurable without it. Science is still losing the forest for the trees in this process. Researchers fail to understand or consider the most basic ways in which we care for one another. They do not consider acts such as emotional support or tight hugs as types of altruism, since these behaviors do not seem strange. We are lucky indeed if our lives are so suffused with acts of care that they fail to warrant notice. We must flip this bias on its head. The fact that most of our aid takes the form of caring for those we are closest to does not render it common or unworthy. Instead, it makes it real and important. It is the basis of human flourishing. Being emotionally and physically close to other people, in a way that feels good and raises our spirits, is so difficult and important that people seek therapy for years or decades to figure out how to do it better. Caregiving behaviors were essential to the very survival of our ancestors for hundreds of millions of years. They are an essential part of the origin of altruism, the origin of our species. Overview. This book was designed to explain the altruistic urge, which we instinctually feel in very specific situations that mimic our ancestral, and still important, need to care for helpless offspring. I have described this altruistic urge enough times now that I have heard the same concerns repeatedly, primarily from people who take the view that altruism must be weird and special and must require a great large brain or an uncommonly giving spirit. As such, I focus this book on explaining the altruistic response model while addressing such common complaints. As a preview, the introduction provides a richly detailed description of the way that rodents that have recently given birth, which scientists call maternal dams, retrieve newborn pups back to the safety of the nest. This behavior is clearly adaptive, and we understand much about the neurobiology of this caregiving act, which greatly resembles altruistic responding. The remainder of the book argues that offspring retrievals like this are foundational to our understanding of altruistic responses, which can occur in similar types of situations. Chapter 1 provides an overview of the altruistic response model and a preview of the rest of the book. Chapter 2 explains how a behavior that we regard so highly in humans could possibly be shared with other species, rats even, because of the way the brain itself evolved over millennia and shares features with the brains of other caregiving mammals. Chapter 3 explains how the altruistic response model applies to a specific form of altruism without necessarily affecting the types of altruism that we usually study, like deliberated aid or monetary donations. The altruistic urge is involved in these other forms at times, without being necessary or sufficient for them. Chapter 4 explains how something could be described as an urge, or even instinct, without meaning that the behavior is fixed, emerges intact, is context-free, or is relevant only to primitive species. Chapter 5 briefly summarizes the neural mechanisms supporting the altruistic urge and their overlap with known neural mechanisms for other reward-motivated behaviors. Chapters 6 and 7 address how the situation and qualities of the victim and observer influence the likelihood of an altruistic response in a way that reflects the origin as a caregiving instinct. Chapter 8 describes the most popular existing theories for how altruism evolved, is motivated, and occurs in the brain. I compare and contrast the altruistic response model to these evolutionary and neuropsychological theories to demonstrate the benefits of this model within the landscape of other views. The conclusion reiterates the basic model, describing gaps in our knowledge and studies that still need to be done, and explaining why I intentionally did not extend this model to explain all of human morality. Altruism is a lot of things to a lot of people. Herein, I describe our origin as a species that is driven to help victims in the greatest need without giving it a second thought. An impressive feat, if I ever saw one. Introduction. The Curious Case of the Assiduous Dams. In a now classic study conducted in 1969, a physiological psychologist at San Fernando Valley State College, William E. Wilsoncroft, was studying mother rats' motivation to retrieve their newborn pups. Before this study, research spanning back to the early 20th century had already shown that such maternal rat dams are highly motivated to approach and contact their own pups. They will even retrieve the new pups of another dam to which they are not even related. This research documented that the instinct to retrieve pups was strong enough that the newly maternal dams were willing to learn complex mazes in order to gain access to young pups, and they even walked across electrified grids to reach their litters. The new moms were literally accepting electric shocks to access pups, testifying to the relative strength of this motivation compared to other enticing rewards. Dams were more willing to cross an even higher number of these electrified grids to access their litter of pups than to receive food, drink, or even sex. This instinct, referred to in scientific studies as offspring retrieval, is pronounced in these rats on the days immediately after giving birth. In this particular 1969 experiment, Wilson-Croft was interested in determining if rat dams would press a bar to receive access to a pup that the experimenters delivered down a small chute into the test chamber, just as they would press a bar for food pellets, the more typical reward for bar pressing in rat conditioning experiments. To measure the motivation of the dam to access and retrieve pups, Wilson-Croft initially trained the female rats, when they were still pregnant, to press a bar to receive food pellets, so that they would understand how the system worked. Then, the day after giving birth, the dams were tested in a sequence that began with 6 bar presses, each rewarded with the original food pellets, followed by 6 bar presses rewarded with each dam's own pups, which the experimenters delivered down the same chute as the food pellets. Just as with the food pellets, the dams retrieved each pup from the conditioning chamber before carrying it back to their adjacent nest chamber by grabbing the pup by the scruff in their mouth, as is common in 4-legged mammals. Afterward, the experimenters swapped each dam's own pups out for unrelated ones from another dam that had given birth around the same time. One after another, the dams pressed the bar to receive an unrelated pup down the chute, which they would dutifully return to the safety of the nest before beginning the sequence anew. Press bar, receive pup, carry to nest. The experimenters ostensibly created a circular conveyor belt of pups, which were repeatedly circled back to the eager dams, which were always ready for more. It is important to realize that at this point in the experiment, the dams were no longer receiving any food rewards for acting. The pups were not related to her, and they were under no obligation to press the bar at all. The dams could have just sat there and rested once the food pellets or her offspring disappeared from the equation. The strange pups themselves were the dam's reward for pressing the bar. The experiment lasted for 3 hours. The dams retrieved unrelated pup after pup after pup until the exhausted experimenters decided that the dam's pup retrieval response would not lessen. As they amusingly noted in the published article, the only real extinction appeared to occur in the experimenters, who got tired of removing the pups from the nest box and filling the delivery apparatus. Wilson-Croft's study shows how the typical dam retrieved approximately 1 pup every 30 seconds for the entire 180 minutes of the experiment. Even more impressive, the best-performing dam retrieved twice as many pups as the average dam, 684 in total, traveling an estimated 4,000 feet in the process, half of the time, 2,000 feet, while also dragging the pup in her mouth. This study is evocative. It is just a short report, perhaps containing fewer total words than my description. It is memorable, of course, for the amusing imagery of pups traversing down a chute, into the nest, and back again, time after time, like kids circling back to the top of the best slide at the water park. The article is also written in an older scientific style, whereby the researcher provided more conversational, vivid, and random details about the experiment than is permissible today. For example, reporting the specific quantitative feats performed by the most tenacious dam, or revealing that the experimenters were the ones who became too tired to continue, would be uncommon today. despite the fact that these attributes add considerably to our understanding of the phenomenon. Wollstonecraft was also mindful to report that no pups were hurt in the process. A sweet inclusion, given that animal cruelty was not particularly a hot-button issue at the time, and perhaps a sign, in and of itself, of our concern for the welfare of neonates. Details like these, along with other odd descriptions from research at the time, such as the way confused dams tried to retrieve their own tails back to the nest, are essential to our ability to understand the biological and neural bases of the behavior. These details speak volumes about the hot motivational state and the almost fixed and reflexive nature of offspring retrieval, which is something that you could not just infer from summary statistics on the mean number of pups retrieved. Taken together, I love this old brief report because it provides us with a strong and memorable sense of the sheer strength of the dam's motivation to access pups after birth, even those that do not belong to her, even without a reward. I have chosen this study as a center point for this book, not only because it's amusing and instructive, but also because it parallels a highly lauded but poorly understood human behavior: altruistic responding. This book describes how these parallels are not a mere accident or an analogy, but rather reflect the fact that our very evolution as caregiving mammals motivates us to respond to others' urgent need with aid. The fact that we already possess so much data on the neurobiology of offspring care across species also allows us to build a more complete picture of human altruism in the brain and in our behavior. The benefits of an odd experimental design. When generalizing from the laboratory to real life, the Wollstonecraft study is clearly an artificial situation that produced a more concentrated set of retrievals than would ever occur naturally in the wild. No rat dam in the field has ever had the opportunity to save or retrieve hundreds of unrelated pups in a single afternoon. We might observe her retrieving a handful of her own pups in the burrow, or perhaps a few dozen if the dams lived communally. As such, this experiment sacrifices some of the ecological validity of the behavior. However, the sheer extremity of their retrievals, which could only be observed under such artificial conditions, sheds light on the way that mammals evolved a powerful motivation to secure pups. It is key for understanding the altruistic urge that we understand the true power of this motivation to retrieve, and its ability to reward the dams for doing so, which you could not infer from just observing a few natural pup retrievals in the wild. There are actually multiple attributes of this pup retrieval system that you would not assume from observing natural behavior, which are conveyed by this one informative study. If you observed a dam naturally retrieving her pup in the wild, you would not assume that she would also retrieve unrelated pups. It would be sensible to assume that such pup retrievals are restricted to offspring, given the privilege that evolution applies to behaviors that benefit one's own shared genes. However, the truth of the matter is more interesting and complex. Close systematic observation and experimentation across species has demonstrated considerable variation in the degree that offspring care is restricted to related neonates or also generalizes to non-kin. For example, if a species usually does not encounter unrelated neonates, there is no requirement for a neurobiological mechanism that discriminates between related and unrelated pups, such that one can avoid caring for non-relatives. As a result, dams may be inspired to accidentally retrieve any neonate, just as they did in Wollstonecraft's lab. These accidents would usually not harm the species in the long run, since such opportunities are rare, if not non-existent. Conversely, if a species is surrounded by offspring that are related, As in many alloparental species that care for nieces, nephews, cousins, and other group members, then there is a genetic benefit to broadly offering care, owing to the shared genes and the mutual reciprocating support provided by the group.
Sample complete. Ready to continue?